This video will be over the lymphatic system and the lymphoid organs and tissues. So the lymphatic system, its main function is to return fluids that are leaked from blood vessels back to the blood, and it's going to consist of three parts. One is a network of lymphatic vessels, and these are often just called lymphatics. The second is lymph, which is the actual fluid in the vessels, and the third is lymph nodes, which are going to actually cleanse the lymph. Lymphoid organs and tissues provide the structural basis of the immune system, which is there are the videos that you should have just gone over, because they serve as the sort of location for both phagocytic cells and lymphocytes. And the structures in the lymphatic system include the spleen, the thymus, tonsils, lymph nodes, and other lymphoid tissues, which we'll see a little bit later in the. So the way that the lymphatic system is going to return this interstitial fluid and these plasma proteins back to the blood is via lymphatic vessels. And this says this is an elaborate network of drainage vessels. It's actually as extensive as the circulatory system. So the lymphatic system is going to circulate about 3 liters of interstitial fluid per day. And once it enters the lymphatic systems, this is when it is called lymph. So this is a one-way system, and lymph is going to flow only towards the heart. Lymphatics include lymphatic capillaries and larger lymphatic vessels. And so the lymphatic capillaries are these blind-ended vessels that it says that weaves between tissue cells and blood capillaries. They often parallel the route of blood capillaries. You don't have them in bones, teeth, and bone marrow. They were once thought to be absent from the central nervous system, but there are locations of lymphatic capillaries in meninges where they'll help to drain not only interstitial fluid, but also cerebrospinal fluid. They do, however, play only a limited role in the drainage of cerebrospinal fluid. So lymphatic capillaries are similar to blood capillaries in terms of their structure, but they're actually more permeable. And because they're more permeable, they can take up larger molecules and particles that blood capillaries can't. And so examples of these would be some large proteins, cell debris, pathogens, cancer cells. And so it's unfortunate that the pathogens and the cancer cells can make their way into the lymphatic capillaries. But this is kind of the cost of having more permeable vessels. So because of this, they can act as a route for pathogens or cancer cells to travel throughout the entire. So the audio on the last slide may have cut out a little bit early. What I had to say there was that unfortunately that the lymphatic system can serve as a route for pathogen and cancer cells to reach the rest of the body because of the permeability of the lymphatic capillaries. So in this slide, this is a structural relationship between a capillary bed of the circulatory system and lymphatic capillaries. And if you'll recall from the circulatory system, hydrostatic pressure pushes blood plasma out into interstitial space, and osmotic pressure brings it back in. But the osmotic pressure is not equivalent to the hydrostatic pressure, so interstitial fluid stays more out in the interstitial space. And it's the job of the lymphatic system to actually drain it. And so because the lymphatic system serves as additional drainage for these capillaries, there's a very extensive network of lymphatic capillaries that is associated with the circulatory system capillaries. So lymphatic capillaries have this increased permeability for 2 reasons. First of all, the endothelial cells that make up the lymphatic capillaries, they overlap to form one-way sort of mini valves. Now these are anchored by collagen filaments to the matrix of the tissue around them. And what this means is that increases in extracellular fluid volume opens these mini valves even more and actually makes the lymphatic capillaries more permeable. So a decrease in extracellular fluid will cause these valves to close. Lacteals are specialized lymphatic capillaries that are in the intestinal mucosa, and their job, as you might remember from AMP1, is to absorb digested fat and deliver this to the bloodstream. Okay, so here are the sort of blind-ended tubes, and you can see the overlap that's in between the endothelial cells. So first of all, these are the filaments that anchor these cells to the connective tissue. But secondly, here's the endothelial cell, and there's the mini valve. And I think you can see, um, I mentioned that these capillaries are blind-ended. It means that they're closed. And so I think you can see from this picture that right in this location, if there's more fluid coming in, if there's more extracellular fluid present, then it'll open these mini valves up wider here and also here, and it'll make these lymphatic capillaries actually more permeable. So the larger lymphatic vessels drain are called collecting lymphatic vessels, and these are what lymphatic capillaries drain into. So these consist of collecting vessels, collecting trunks, and collecting ducts. Now these have structures and membranes that are similar to the veins, except that they have thinner walls, and they've also actually got more internal valves than veins do. These also anastomose more frequently, meaning that they're going to connect to one another more frequently than veins do. So collecting vessels in the skin will travel with superficial veins, but deep vessels will actually travel alongside arteries. So of these larger lymphatic vessels, you've also got lymphatic trunks, which drain large areas of the body. And these are named for the regions of the body that they drain. So you've got paired lumbar trunks, paired bronchomediastinal trunks, paired subclavian trunks, paired jugular trunks, and a single intestinal trunk. And a single intestinal trunk. So lymph is delivered from these trunks into one of two lymphatic ducts, and these are going to be the very largest structures of the lymphatic system. The right lymphatic duct receives lymph from the right upper arm and the right side of the head and the thorax. The thoracic duct will receive lymph from the rest of the body, so it's going to be larger than the right lymphatic duct. So in about half of individuals, the thoracic duct starts out as an enlarged sac that is called the cisterna chyli. Each one of these will empty lymph into the venous circulation right where the internal jugular and the subclavian veins join on its own side of the body. So the right lymphatic duct will empty lymph into the junction of the right internal jugular and the right subclavian vein on the right side of the body. And the thoracic duct will drain into basically the subclavian vein at the junction of it and the internal jugular vein on the left side of the body. So they're kind of paired to their side of the body. Okay, so in this diagram, we're going to take a look at the major lymphatic vessels that are associated with the right lymphatic duct and with the thoracic duct. So this would be a person who is facing you. So their right would be on your left. So when we take a look at the right lymphatic duct, you're going to look at the top left of the diagram. So starting up at that top left, you have the right jugular trunk, which is responsible for draining lymph from the right side of the head and neck. You have the right lymphatic duct, which is responsible for draining lymph from the right arm. And you have the right bronchomediastinal trunk, which is responsible for draining lymph from the right side of the thorax. All of these together make the right lymphatic duct, which of course drains lymph from the right upper limb, the right side of the head, and the right side of the thorax. And so it's going to empty into the blood, as you can see here, at the junction of the right internal jugular and right subclavian vein. So next we're going to take a look at the major vessels that lead into the thoracic duct, which is responsible for actually draining the majority of the body. So we're going to start on your lower right, which would be their lower left. So this is the intestinal trunk, the left lumbar trunk, and the right lumbar trunk, which are going to drain, which is going to carry lymph from the lower limbs and the abdominal cavity up towards the thorax. So here you see the cisterna chyli, which is present again in 50% of individuals, but this is the site at which these three major trunks actually join. Now if you look at the label right below where it points out the ribs, you'll see the thoracic duct. So the thoracic duct is going to carry drainage not only from these lower limbs and from the abdominal cavity area, but also from the lymphatic vessels that are in the thoracic region. Okay, moving upward from there, you're going to see the left bronchomediastinal trunk, which is responsible for draining a significant portion of the right thorax, the left thorax, excuse me. You're going to see the left subclavian vein, and this is again what is the thoracic duct is going to drain into. Above that, you're going to see the left jugular trunk, which is going to drain the left side of the head and neck, and the left subclavian trunk, which is going to drain the left arm. So all of these join into the thoracic duct, which drains lymph from the entire rest of the body, the portions that the right lymphatic duct don't cover. And it will empty into the bloodstream at the junction of the left internal jugular and the left subclavian veins. So now we're going to take a look at how lymph is transported through the lymphatic system. So it's a low pressure system like the venous system, and therefore it's going to contain a lot of the same mechanisms for propelling lymph. So one is milking action of the skeletal muscle. So skeletal muscles that surround lymph will squeeze the lymphatic vessels the same way that they do veins. You're also going to get transport of lymph by pressure changes in the thorax during breathing, just as with veins in the abdominothoracic regions. You're also going to have valves to prevent backflow. In this case, pulsations of nearby arteries are going to assist with lymph transport. You'll recall that with the deeper lymphatic vessels, they actually parallel arteries. And so as they parallel arteries, as these arteries get stretched out and then snap back in response to the pressure by the heart, that when an artery stretches out, it's going to compress the lymphatic vessel that parallels it just a little bit and help with lymph transport. Additionally, there is contraction of smooth muscle in the walls of lymphatics. These would be the larger ones, but I don't believe that that plays a particularly major role in lymph transport. So physical activity will increase the flow of lymph just the same way that it does with venous blood. And therefore, if you immobilize an area that's been injured and that has needed to be inflamed, then this can actually promote faster healing. So that you may be saying, thanks, Captain Obvious, staying still helps with injury, but this is another reason why staying still with an injury can help it. Okay, so we're going to take a look at some of the different ways or different things that can go wrong with the lymphatic system. So lymphangitis is a condition in which the lymphatic vessels will appear as red lines under the skin, and this is caused by an inflammation of lymphatic vessels that contain vasovasora. And so vasovasora are smaller blood vessels that supply the tissue of large blood vessels and large lymphatic vessels with blood. So like every other type of cell in the body, the cells that make up both blood vessels and large lymphatic vessels also need an oxygen supply, so they have their own smaller blood vessels called vasovasora, literally blood vessels of blood vessels. So when the vasovasora become congested with blood, this can cause lymphangitis. And so again, the reason why is that larger lymphatics receive their nutrients from vasovasora. Lymphedema is a severe localized edema, and this is caused by anything that will prevent the normal return of lymph to blood. So this is localized swelling. This can be caused by tumors blocking lymphatics. Sometimes the lymphatics can be blocked or removed during cancer surgery, which will prevent the normal return of lymph to blood in those localized areas. Lymphedema can improve if some lymphatic pathways remain and enlarge to accommodate the increased flow that they need to have. Okay, so we're going to take a look now at lymphoid cells, tissues, and organs. So lymphatic cells can consist of immune system cells that are found in lymphoid tissue, so that's going to be a lot of them, and the supporting cells that form the lymphoid tissue structures. And so you're going to have immune system cells, which are going to be lymphocytes, and these will mature, of course, into T cells and B cells. The lymphoid cells, the T cells and B cells will protect against antigens. So this is something that you learn with your videos on the immune system. These are examples. I don't feel the need to go over those again because you've been through those with the immune system. T cells manage the immune response. So again, a lot of this is repetition of what you've seen already. B cells producing antibodies and the job of antibodies. Other lymphoid immune cells are going to be macrophages, which are there for phagocytosis, but they also help activate T cells. So a good example of that would be a dendritic cell, which you see right here. Okay, and the supporting lymphoid cells include reticular cells, and these produce reticular fibers that help support the lymphoid organ, the structure of the lymphatic organs. Okay, and stroma, again, this is scaffolding for immune cells. So these are this is sort of a location where these immune cells can cluster. So here you're going to see a macrophage at the top. You can see the reticular cells that are on the reticular fibers, and you can see what the reticular fibers themselves actually are. So what are the main functions of lymphoid tissue? Well, they'll house and provide places where lymphocytes can divide. They offer places where lymphocytes and macrophages can surveil or sort of check the lymph for pathogens or cancer cells and so forth and so on. They're largely composed of reticular connective tissue, and you just saw the reticular fibers in the previous slide. So again, this is a type of loose connective tissue. So these lymphoid organs aren't really as tightly packed as some other organs are. So macrophages will live on reticular fibers, and the space between the fibers, again, this offers a place for lymphocytes to occupy. So this is what I meant by scaffolding for lymphocytes to occupy when they return from patrolling the body. There are two main types of lymphoid tissues. One is diffuse lymphoid tissue, which is a loose arrangement of lymphoid cells with some associated reticular fibers. Now, these are found in just about every body organ. So there is a lot of lymphoid tissue spread around the body. You find larger collections of these in the lamina propria of mucous membranes. And when we take a look at the digestive system, there is a lot of this diffuse lymphoid tissue found in that particular layer, the lamina propria. Lymphoid follicles are solid bodies. They've got tightly packed lymphoid cells and reticular fibers. So this is not loose, this is much more tightly compacted. So these will have germinal centers of proliferating B cells. And they may form part of larger lymphoid organs like lymph nodes. So again, you've got diffuse lymphoid tissue and lymphoid follicles, and these are the main types of lymphoid tissue. And so the lymphoid follicles can make up larger lymphoid organs. There are also isolated lymphoid follicles that are in the Peyer's patches and in the appendix. And so the Peyer's patches are present, and it's basically around the intestines. So lymphoid organs get grouped into two functional categories. One is primary lymphoid organs, and these are the areas where T and B cells mature. And so this is going to be the thymus and the red bone marrow, respectively. And the secondary lymphoid organs, which is where the mature lymphocytes first encounter their antigen and become activated. So examples of these are going to be the lymph nodes, the spleen, mucosa-associated lymphoid tissue, and the diffuse lymphoid tissues that we discussed just a little bit earlier. Okay, so here's where these different lymphoid organs are located. Here's the thymus. It kind of drapes over the heart. But again, after adolescence, it begins to deteriorate. And at your ages, there's going to be some of it left. At my age, just about none of it's going to be left. So here's the red bone marrow. And again, I want you to remember that the red bone marrow is where all of T cells and B cells are actually formed. They will just mature or become immunocompetent in the thymus and in the red bone marrow. So all of the lymphocytes are actually produced in the red bone marrow. It's just that the T cells will migrate to the thymus for their immunocompetence testing. Okay, lymph nodes, we're going to take another look at those. You can see those on figure 20.3. They're in a lot of different bundles, and we'll see that a little bit later. You see the location of the tonsils. Here's the spleen. Here are the Peyer's patches, and as I said, they're associated with the intestines. And you're going to find some lymphatic tissue in the appendix. Okay, so the lymph nodes are the principal secondary lymphoid organs of the body. They're a whole lot smaller than the other organs, but there's a whole lot more of them. So you'll find hundreds of them actually throughout the body. Most of them are in connective tissue alongside lymphatic vessels. Some of them are nearer to the body surface, and these are the ones where you can actually detect swelling. So in the inguinal region, the axillary and cervical regions of the body, and this usually happens where collecting vessels actually converge into trunks. And so the cervical lymph nodes, if you've ever put your fingers up under your jawline and felt the swelling of the lymph nodes, this is the ones that are in the cervical regions. And you may have noticed that you can occasionally feel them in your armpits in the axillary region as well. So your two main functions of the lymph nodes are to act as filters for the lymph and cleanse it. And so macrophages are supposed to remove and destroy microorganisms and debris that enter the lymph. So they're kind of the first stage of defense against pathogens and that enter the lymphatic system. What you're trying to do is to prevent these pathogens from going system-wide. So they'll also try to keep these things out of the bloodstream as well. The other main function of lymph nodes is to act as a location for immune system activation. So this is actually the location where lymphocytes will become activated and start an attack against a foreign antigen. So this is the diagram that I was referring to earlier that shows you the different clusters of lymph nodes. So if you take a look at the right, you'll see the regional areas of the lymph nodes, the ones that are close to the surface at least. So you see where the cervical nodes are, the axillary nodes are, and the inguinal nodes are. But I also wanted to let you know that there are clusters of them that are close to the collecting lymphatic vessels, that are close to the cisternic chyli and the thoracic duct, and they're also right there at the entrance of the right lymphatic duct into its vein, and also the thoracic duct into the vein. So you've got hundreds of these axillary nodes spread out all throughout the body. Okay, so they do vary in size, but all of them are going to be less than 1 inch. Most of them are bean-shaped. They basically look like tiny kidneys if you were able to dissect them. So they're surrounded by a fibrous capsule, so they're encapsulated organs. And these capsule fibers actually extend inward as structures called trabeculae, and these divide the lymph nodes into the compartments. Now, as with many other organs, there are distinct regions or layers of the lymph node, the cortex, which is on the outside, and the medulla, which is deep to the cortex. So here's the cortex, and you're going to see a number of things associated with that. So if you look at the highlighted area, this contains follicles with germinal centers, and there are a lot of dividing B cells here. The deep cortex is going to have T cells in transit, which isn't really well shown on this particular diagram. So the T cells will circulate continuously among the blood, the lymph nodes, and the lymph. And so the deep cortex is basically where the T cells will sort of enter and exit the lymph node. There are a lot of dendritic cells that are closely associated with both T and B cells in the cortex. And the reason why they're there is because they play a role in activating both lymphocytes. So again, these serve as antigen-presenting cells, the APCs that you learned about when you saw the immune system. Okay, the medulla is deep to the cortex, and if you look at the highlighting, you'll see medullary cords that extend inward from the cortex. These contain B cells, T cells, and plasma cells. You find lymph sinuses throughout the node, and these are going to be large lymphatic capillaries that have got crisscrossing reticular fibers over them. Now, macrophages, again, are going to reside on these fibers. They'll check for any foreign matter, and they'll take it up and phagocytize it. So as far as the circulation through and into and out of the lymph nodes go, so lymph will enter the sort of outer portion, the larger curve of the lymph node through the afferent lymphatic vessels. So if you were to look at this organ, you might think that those lymphatic vessels that are clustered at the hilum on the right side would be the afferent vessels. They're actually not. They're the efferent ones. And so afferent lymphatic vessels actually come into the lymph node um, from the outer sort of larger curve here. And you can see that generally you're going to find a lymphatic vessel associated with the portions of the lymph node that are divided by the trabeculae. So they'll travel through what are called the subscapular sinus, and you can see the highlighted area there. And from there, lymph goes into smaller sinuses that you find throughout the cortex and the medulla. Okay, and so again, with the highlighting, you can see where the medullary sinus is. And after the medullary sinus, you'll see at the hilum and the efferent lymphatic vessels where the lymphatic fluid exits from the lymph node. And the presence of fewer efferent vessels means that the lymph can stagnate. Sometimes the flow will really slow down. And what that does is allow the lymphocytes and the macrophages time to carry out their sort of surveillance and phagocytosis of foreign debris and of pathogens. So it allows these two types of cells time to really function, that slow down of the lymph through the lymph node. So it's kind of a little bit of a choke point, or I guess a checkpoint where you can slow things down and check over the lymphatic fluid. And so lymph is going to travel through several nodes at the same time. Okay, so taking a look at the histology of a lymph node, here's a lymphoid follicle, and you can see the trabecula extending down into the lymph node. This is a subscapular sinus. This is the capsule itself. It's made of dense, irregular connective tissue. These are the medullary cords and the medullary sinuses, which are located down in the medulla. So the sort of darker area around the outside, about in this area, is going to be the cortex, and in this area is going to be the medulla. Okay, so if we look at dysfunctions of the lymph nodes, buboes are inflamed lymph nodes that result when these nodes are overwhelmed by what it is that they're trying to destroy. So really extensive infection, and this is actually where you get the name bubonic plague. So this condition often gets referred to as swollen glands. Sometimes these buboes get pus-filled, and again, bubonic plague was named after this feature of this disease. Lymph nodes can unfortunately become secondary cancer sites if metastasizing cancer cells become trapped in the node. So basically, the cancer cells can kind of take up residence in the lymph nodes. So if cancer has spread from its initial organ to the lymph nodes that surround it, sometimes this spread of cancer cells into the surrounding lymph nodes gets called stage 2 cancer. So these lymph nodes that get infiltrated by cancer cells, they're swollen but usually not painful. And this is something that can usually help distinguish cancerous lymph nodes from those that are infected by microorganisms. So you may have noticed that whenever you have lymph nodes that are swollen, they're also pretty painful. But if they're unusually swollen and they're not painful, this can be an indication that you've got cancer cells in those nodes. So next we're going to look at the spleen, and this is a really well vascularized, a very blood-rich organ that's about the size of your fist on the left side of the abdominal cavity, and it's just below the level of the stomach. It is the largest lymphoid organ, and it gets served by the splenic artery and vein, and these enter and exit at the hilum of the spleen. We'll see a diagram of that in just a minute. So the functions of the spleen are, this is another site of lymphocyte proliferation, another site of immune surveillance and response. So in that respect, the spleen is a little bit like a large-scale lymph node. However, it also cleanses the blood of aged blood cells and platelets, and this is what keeps it from being basically just a large lymph node. It's also got functions with the circulatory system. Macrophages are also going to remove debris from the bloodstream in this place. So the spleen serves as kind of a large size filter for both the lymphatic system and the circulatory system. So here's the location of the spleen. If you look in the middle on the right, you can see it's about the same level as the stomach. So here's a basic diagram of the spleen. You can see the splenic artery and the splenic vein and the location of the hilum. So here's a photograph of a spleen in its normal position. So you see where the spleen is and where the splenic artery is as well. There are 3 additional functions of the spleen other than its blood filtering and lymph filtering function. First of all, it can store breakdown products of red blood cells, in other words, heme and iron, for later reuse. Secondly, it can store blood platelets and monocytes for release into the blood for when they're needed. And third, it can be the site of fetal erythrocyte production, so red blood cell production in the fetus. The spleen is encased by a fibrous capsule, and it also has trabeculae, so there's another similarity with the lymph nodes. But histologically, it's going to be composed of 2 components. One is white pulp, and the other is red pulp. So if you look at these diagrams, the white pulp, and you'll see this in the highlighting, is the site where the immune function occurs. So these are going to be the areas where you're going to have some proliferation and some storage of lymphocytes and also some filtration of the lymphatic fluid. So this is going to contain mostly lymphocytes on reticular fibers, and you're going to find these clusters around central arteries. So if you were looking at a slide of the spleen and having to identify that for a lab practical, the blood vessel is what would be your main key for what is a white pulp cluster. Now I can tell you this, that the really weird thing is that between red pulp and white pulp, you would think that white pulp would be lighter under a microscope, but it's actually darker. It's because the cells that are in the white pulp are white blood cells, which have nuclei, and the DNA within those nuclei stains darker than the red blood cells. So ironically enough, the white pulp is actually darker under a microscope than the red pulp is. Okay, so the red pulp has a lot of old red blood cells and a lot of bloodborne pathogens. This is where they get destroyed. So again, you can see the red pulp highlighted in sort of pink at the top and the bottom layer, and this is actually going to make up the majority of the spleen in terms of its histology, in terms of the tissue. And it's also, again, like I said, it's going to be lighter staining under the microscope, and that there's going to be a little bit more of a difference, I think, between white pulp and red pulp under maybe your microscope at school than it is here in this diagram. Okay, so there's a lot of red blood cells and macrophages that engulf them, but again, since there's so many red blood cells that stain lighter, red pulp is lighter under the microscope. It also contains splenic cords that separate splenic sinuses, which are venous sinuses. Okay, so the spleen's got a thin capsule. It's not as durable as what you see in other encapsulated organs. So if you get a direct blow to it or a severe infection to it, then the spleen can rupture, and what this will do is to spill blood into the peritoneal cavity, and it's a considerable amount of blood. So because the vascularization, because the blood flow into and out of the spleen is so complex, if the spleen gets damaged, the usual solution to that is a splenectomy, which is going to be a removal of the ruptured spleen. So I'll tell you this, the spleen is actually responsible for steering column airbags more than anything else, because in head-on collisions or collisions where the front of the car impacted an object, people used to get thrown into the steering column a lot, and that stood a very good chance of severely injuring the spleen. And so it actually used to be part of, before airbags were really prominent in vehicles, it used to be a substantial part of training for first responders to palpate the abdomen and check and see if there was a lot of bleeding out into the abdomen, because the weird thing about an injury to the spleen is that the victim of that injury wouldn't necessarily register it as extremely painful. So they'd get out of the wreck, they'd walk around, they would seem okay, and then they would just drop over because of the excessive bleeding into the peritoneal cavity. And so a lot of the time, first responders would say, "Are you okay? Do you feel okay?" And they would make sure to palpate their abdomen to try to detect any peritoneal bleeding into the peritoneal cavity. Okay, so this used to be the treatment to prevent hemorrhage and shock, a standard, and it still is a standard, I think, for severe damage, but for lesser damage, the spleen can often repair itself. The frequency of emergency splenectomies has decreased dramatically, and the main reason, I think, is because of airbags in cars. Now, if the spleen has to be removed, then the liver and bone marrow can take over most of its functions. In children that are younger than 12, the spleen will regenerate if just a small part of it is left. So with kids, they can have some regeneration of their spleen. Okay, so next we're going to talk about MALT, which is mucosa-associated lymphoid tissue. So this is lymphoid tissue that is found in mucous membranes throughout the body, and the main function of MALT is to protect the body from pathogens trying to enter it through mucous membranes. It's found in the mucosa of the respiratory tract, the genitourinary organs, and the digestive tract. The largest collections of MALT are found in the tonsils, in the Peyer's patches surrounding the intestines, and the appendix. So here's a look at the tonsils. These are the simplest lymphoid organs. So basically, you've just got a ring of lymphatic tissue that's around the pharynx, and these appear to be swellings of the mucosa. They're named according to the location, so you can see that there are pharyngeal, palatine, and lingual tonsils in the pharynx, associated with the hard palate and associated with the tongue, respectively. So again, the palatine tonsils are at the posterior end of the oral cavity. These are the largest of the tonsils, and these are the ones that are most commonly infected. And you can actually see videos on YouTube of people having tonsil stones removed from these palatine tonsils. It's because these are sort of pockets in which food and debris and bacteria can collect, and that can serve as a start point for tonsillitis. And so sometimes it's a good thing to remove tonsil stones when they're impacted in the tonsils. So the lingual tonsils is a collection of follicles at the base of the tongue. And the pharyngeal tonsils, these are also called adenoids. These are in the posterior wall of the nasopharynx. The tubal tonsils surround the openings of the auditory tubes into the pharynx. So again, the function is to gather and remove pathogens that are in the food and in the air. And again, they're going to contain, as you can see highlighted at the bottom, germinal centers in lymphoid follicles. They're not fully encapsulated, so there's some loose tissue here. And the overlying epithelium will sort of push into the epithelium, which forms the tonsillar crypts, and you can see that on the right, highlighted below. So bacteria and food particles enter these crypts, they get trapped here and they get destroyed. But as I said earlier, it can be a little bit risky to lure bacteria into these tissues because this serves as a place where they can multiply. But on the other hand, it can allow immune cells to become activated and build memory cells against these potential pathogens before they have a chance to enter the rest of the body. So Peyer's patches are lymphoid follicles in the walls of the distal portion of the small intestine. They're sometimes called aggregated lymphoid nodules. So you can see on the right where the follicles of the Peyer's patches are. They're structurally similar to tonsils, so not completely encapsulated. And their location aids in their functions, which are, first of all, destroying bacteria, preventing them from getting through the intestinal walls, and also to generate memory lymphocytes. The appendix is another lymphoid organ that we're going to talk about. It is an offshoot of the first part of the large intestine. So this contains a large number of lymphoid follicles, and as with Peyer's patches, they'll destroy bacteria, hopefully keeping them from getting through the intestinal wall, and they will also generate memory lymphocytes. So one of the things that can happen in a lower GI tract infection called diverticulitis is that the combination of the infection and the resulting inflammation can actually cause perforations in the intestinal wall. And so the Peyer's patches and the appendix are reasons why this isn't a lot more common than what it actually is. Okay, the thymus is a lymphoid organ that's found in the inferior neck, and much of the time it sort of drapes over the heart. So, as I said, it's in the mediastinum and partially overlies the heart. Now, its function you've been through with the immune system. This is the lymphoid organ where T cells mature, and as I've said during those PowerPoints, it's the most active and largest in its size during the childhood. It stops growing during adolescence, then it atrophies as you get older. It will still produce immunocompetent cells, but a lot more slowly because there's simply a lot less volume to it. The thymus is broken into lobules that contain an outer cortex and an inner medulla. So the cortex is going to contain rapidly dividing lymphocytes and scattered macrophages, and the medulla contains fewer lymphocytes and thymic corpuscles. So the thymic corpuscles are where regulatory T cells develop, and these are the types of T cells that help to prevent autoimmunity. Okay, there are a number of ways in which the thymus differs from other lymphoid organs. It doesn't have follicles because it doesn't have B cells. It doesn't directly fight antigens because it lacks B cells. Its function is basically T cell or T lymphocyte maturation, and it contains a blood thymus barrier, and this is going to keep immature T lymphocytes isolated, and this will do a number of things. It'll help prevent premature activation, but it'll also keep lymphocytes that haven't gone through immunocompetence testing. It'll prevent those from entering the bloodstream as well. So the stroma of the thymus is made up of epithelial cells. It's not made up of reticular fibers. So there's another difference. The sort of supportive scaffolding of the thymus is made up of epithelial cells and not reticular fibers. So this is the environment in which the T lymphocytes become immunocompetent. Okay, so here's our summary of the lymphoid organs and tissues. So I'm not going to go over this point by point, but if you want to, you can pause the video and look at this. And so this is going to be the major functions and descriptions of these lymphoid organs in terms of whether they're encapsulated, which layers they had, if any, whether they have lymphoid follicles, what their stroma are made up of, and what special features that they have. And that's the end.